Beirut, once a jewel among Middle Eastern cities, has been decaying for decades. The port explosion on August 4th may have been the city's death blow. It didn't just kill 200 people, injure 6,000, and leave 300,000 homeless. The country was dying. The Lebanese dream long since destroyed. The beauty of Lebanon, its unique identity in the region, its allure and romance and promise were always based on a myth, punctured every few years by brutality, and then quickly stitched up and covered with enough makeup to convince us it was still attractive. And while the Lebanese people rightly blame outside forces for controlling their destiny through wars and sanctions, and they blame a corrupt political elite, the people were the system. They participated and they benefited, and they too, with the exception of the poor and working classes, are to blame. I was there, but made it out unscathed. Others weren't so lucky. People thought it was an airstrike or a car bomb. There were rumors of different places that were hit. Then a dazed population emerged from their damaged homes onto streets strewn with broken glass and bleeding neighbors. They looked up and saw the pink smoke above them coming from the port. So how did this become this? In 2014, Lebanon impounded a ship carrying ammonium nitrate, a fertilizer commonly used in explosives by militias. It was allegedly going to Mozambique, but the circumstances of the ship's purchase, hire, and the crew's subsequent mutiny are very suspicious. Due to the nature of Lebanon's deliberately dysfunctional bureaucracy and weak state, the fertilizer was improperly stored in that warehouse at the country's largest port in its most densely populated city. Officials were warned over the years about the danger, but no one intervened. This could not have come at a worse time for Lebanon. The country was collapsing due to an economic crisis, political instability, and massive anti-corruption demonstrations. The currency lost 80% of its value. Prices were skyrocketing. The middle class was impoverished. Unemployment was over 40%. A dollar shortage made the import of essentials difficult, and power cuts of up to 20 hours a day became the new norm. Then the coronavirus lockdown was imposed in order to prevent a collapse of its already weak and deteriorating healthcare system. The population was becoming pauperized. They got one final massive blow with the explosion. Lebanon's main political parties are run by Civil War-era warlords, or their sons. People like Nabih Berri, Saad Hariri, Samir Jaja, Walid Jumblat, and Michel Aoun. They exploited the system they created to enrich themselves off the post-war neoliberal order that was imposed on Lebanon in the 90s by its ruling elites and international financial institutions. American allied central bank head Riyad Salameh and the warlords, with a nod from the international community, built a Ponzi scheme economy, hollowing out the public sector to make a profit. This corrupt system is why 30 years after the Civil War, the weak Lebanese state can't provide basic services like 24-hour electricity or potable water or waste management. All parties benefited from a system built on sectarianism, where citizens couldn't define their identity or choose who represents them, and where only one thing was more powerful than sect: money. Money brought together rival factions and created a web of officials, bureaucrats, bankers, gangsters, and mafia enforcers to rule without transparency or accountability, and take it for granted that this was their right. Hezbollah, the party of the dispossessed, which elevated Shias out of poverty, became corrupted by this system. They joined the government after 2005 and compromised with right-wing neoliberal parties to protect their interests. They developed their own class of bourgeoisie elites who benefited from the system. As their constituency became wealthier, their class interests collided with their revolutionary ideology and resistance politics. Hezbollah is the least corrupt of the bunch, but since they joined the government in 2005, they've sat by silently while their ML and FPM allies bankrupted the country, making them complicit. They prioritized maintaining a status quo that protected the weapons of the resistance over halting their partners' corruption or objecting to the country's poor governance. But those who built the system and profited from it are largely allies of the Americans, the Europeans, and the Gulf states, and were celebrated as smart and sophisticated until it came crashing down. These guys wore suits and spoke English and French and ate sushi and were thoroughly integrated into the global financial system. Anger at this system prompted an uprising last October that sought to bring down the government and replace it with a non-sectarian state. Anti-Hezbollah actors hijacked that anger, while entrenched interests diverted attention from their complicity and shifted the anger onto the party of the resistance that was least implicated in creating and profiting from the system. As the country burned from the collective arson committed by its elites, its parties, and its population, unbeknownst to most of them, a powder keg at the port was about to explode. Just as with the economy, so too with the port, complacency set in, and people assumed if the disaster had not happened yet, then it would not happen at all. In the aftermath of what appears to have been an accident resulting from criminal negligence and incompetence, anger at the authorities erupted into protests and riots, some righteous and others with an agenda tied to the very warlords who destroyed the country. Now, when bodies are still under the rubble and the bleeding has not stopped, as young Lebanese are displaying the best altruistic volunteer spirit to help their compatriots, some actors are trying to exploit the latest crisis to retake power and deal a blow to their political rivals. Immediately after the port explosion, both local and outside parties redirected anger for the explosion at Hezbollah. Hezbollah indeed smuggles weapons into Lebanon, but not through the port, which it does not control, and is under the careful watch of its rivals, and sits in a part of town that's not sympathetic to the party. Nor does Hezbollah need to import ammonium nitrate when its close Syrian ally, which shares a long land border with Lebanon, produces huge amounts of the material. Politically, Hezbollah is complicit in the system, but it's the least responsible for the crisis. Hezbollah came into existence to resist Israel's occupation of Lebanon, and it deters further Israeli aggression. The Americans and the Israelis want Hezbollah gone and label it a terrorist organization. The group has a huge constituency and is a part of the government because its members were elected to parliament. The West loves democracy until it doesn't give them the results they want. Lebanon's broke. It imports 80% of what it consumes and produces almost nothing. The Beirut port handled about 80% of the country's imports, and now it's gone with no alternative. The Tripoli port in the north isn't even half the size. Lebanon has no land routes for trade. Israel to the south is an enemy country. US sanctions prevent Lebanon from carrying out normal trade with its other neighbor, Syria, and obstruct Lebanese trade with Iraq through Syria. The Beirut port was Lebanon's main gateway for trading with the outside world. So the main port of a country virtually dependent on imports for its survival was just wiped out, along with all the essential food and medical items stored there. Many imports destined for Syria arrived through the Beirut port to bypass sanctions. International aid organizations used that port to supply the desperately needy people of Syria. Their warehouses and logistical operation centers were destroyed. So this explosion will hurt the Syrian people as well. The international community has pledged under $300 million to help, but the damage was in the billions of dollars and the country was already broke. The government has resigned and a new one will be appointed, but it'll be the same people with different names until the system is removed. And the Lebanese people also realize that they're not special. They're not Western and liberal just because they wear miniskirts and know a few words of French. They never ask themselves how in a country which produces nothing, they can afford to live as if they were in Paris and have iPhones and an Ethiopian maid to abuse and trips to Istanbul or Europe. And half of them still hope to subjugate themselves to the Americans or French in return for a bailout. Lebanon wasn't backwards. It was a glimpse of our future. A neoliberal order where profit is placed before people, even if it means risking the lives of millions, and where the one movement which resists that order and seeks independence and dignity is vilified.